Hello, everyone, and welcome to This Week in Enterprise Tech. I'm Hyoun Park from Amalgam Insights, joined as always by Charlie Araujo of the DX Institute. It has been a wild week in tech. This has just been an incredible streak of trade shows and announcements, and of course, the advancement of IT and AI coming together. And of course, last week we saw Microsoft build just an amazing set of announcements and honestly overwhelming in a number of ways. We saw that there are over 100 copilots. I think the number was over 130 that they announced. But more interesting than the number perhaps was that there's this transformation that is happening based on the copilots that are creating. I think you had pointed out as we were chatting before the show today that there's an interesting story on Strategery, I'm never quite sure how to say that, on how Copilot was actually starting to transform Microsoft and how Microsoft was finally starting to figure out how they are more than a Windows company. Of course, they've been making that transformation for a while, but I'm curious, what really got your attention there as you were looking at that and kind of the transformation of Microsoft?
Probably more than I can remember right now, but that was this article that you're referring to was fascinating to me. I think this gentleman does a brilliant job of just sort of analyzing the market and looking at
Yes.
everything. And Microsoft, for many of us, right, is a company that we wrote off a decade ago. That we were basically saying, hey, they had lost their way and they were no longer innovative and they missed the internet train and all of those things. And most of it was rooted in what this article points out. Was rooted in the fact that it was anchored to Windows, and everything revolved around Windows, and that the big thing that Satya did was break that apart, right? To drive this shift, and force this kind of transformation of where everything went. And so this article is actually talking about that one of the things that Microsoft announced actually before build was what they're calling the Copilot Plus PC. It's in a new standard, so they're releasing it in the form of the Surface, but they also have, I think it's 6 or 8 partners that are announcing this new PC, and it's got these very specific defined specs, and the idea is it's able to run local AI workloads, and it's going to speed things up and to be able to leverage it. But what was really interesting was that the point of this was that he found that Windows was now relevant again and interesting. And it wasn't because Windows was driving it, but it was the other way around. It was Azure and AI and the data elements that all now suddenly were driving innovation within the kind of the core of Microsoft. And so I think there's some really interesting lessons there about how to innovate for the enterprise. I think there's a lot of enterprises that probably look a lot like Microsoft did a decade ago, when it was, they're rooted in their historical underpinnings and their foundations, and they can't break free of it. He also tells the story of Walmart and their battle with Amazon, and how they used e-commerce to pivot around it. So, I mean, I highly encourage any CIO to read this article, to think mostly about the macro level, how to drive innovation within your organization and to sort of see through these lenses. So that was what that piece was, and I thought it was fascinating. They also made a lot of announcements. You talk about the 130 copilots. I think that's a problem for them, and I do think it speaks to some of the challenges with this entire space as it develops. But we can keep diving into all of that.
Yes, I think the 130 copilots is indicative of kind of the challenge that we're seeing around what we're now seeing is agentic AI, the idea that all these agents are going to be the interface between us and the actual AI at the end of the day. And we're trying to figure out how to prioritize which of these agents are most meaningful, which of these AIs are most meaningful, and how we're going to rationalize or consolidate or even just understand which agents and which AIs are going to be used at which points. We're starting to finally define some of the use cases that are making AI meaningful around creating initial bases of code or some quick shortcuts to solve the empty screen problem and be able to start working, or to be able to create some templated documentation, especially when there's highly governed or highly detailed documentation that needs to be put into place, and being able to have that template that has been well defined, but perhaps has some nebulous or fuzzy aspects to it. Generative AI is actually really good at all of that stuff. And now we have these Copilot assistants to be able to help with that. But simply being able to access that without having to figure out which of the 80 or 130 or 250 or 8,000 co-pilots are going to finally exist in the long term is going to be an important piece of the puzzle. We're going to have to rationalize and simplify this story just a little bit to make it work.
Yeah, well, what I think is most interesting about it is that it's sort of, there, and I'm going to butcher this, so I'll do my best to paraphrase it so I don't butcher it too bad. But there's an old trope when it comes to automation: is that the first stage of automation is you automate what already exists, and the second stage is you start reimagining what
Yes.
those processes can look like when you have this technology to drive a change in the way you work. And right now, I feel like the copilots are sort of on that first stage, is that we're mostly thinking about copilots in terms of the way an organization works. Because if I think about it, it's like, okay, if I'm in a very large company, there easily are several hundred people that I might have to interact with to solve specific things. And so it's sort of the whole copilot mentality that we're having right now. It's like these are copilots designing to do very specific tasks. But that's mostly because a human has a very limited capacity to specialize in something. But that isn't how we want to function. It's an incredibly frustrating thing to try to figure out who the heck do I go talk to get this problem to solve. Well, why do I want to replicate that with my Copilot model? And I think that's the issue. So I'm a big believer in this idea of persona-based Copilots to a point, when if the point of it is a Copilot designed for me, meaning if it's driven by me, if it's driven by the action I need to get done, right, the thing I need to execute on, then that's a problem. If I have to go figure out which Copilot to use to achieve a specific activity, then that's the problem. And I think right now that's not clearly demarcated as far as which way this is going. And I think it's being exacerbated. One of the other things that that Microsoft announced was this sort of, I don't want to say a shift, but this evolution in posture to really saying, hey, now the next stage is enterprises need to be building their own copilots, right? We're giving you the building blocks. And this article from Verge was talking about how one of those use cases was, for instance, an IT support desk agent. Well, it's like, why am I going to go build that? That doesn't make any sense. It's like, let's go get something off the shelf that is designed to do that. That is a known function. And so I think you have this dilemma, this balance that we're trying to find of where does this really land? And I don't know the answer, but I know that right now, and it's not just Microsoft, right? ServiceNow has already a whole bunch of copilots, right? And we're seeing this all over the place. I don't think we've quite settled on what this process is going to look like yet. And right now, I think it's going to, because it's happening so fast, it's going to create a lot of confusion for an enterprise buyer trying to figure out, do I really need all these copilots? And if I've got a user that needs 6 of them, am I buying 6 separate copilot licenses? I mean, it's going to get crazy pretty quick.
Yes, but one of the things I find interesting about all this is a few years ago when Salesforce bought Slack, they talked about Slack becoming the OS for the enterprise. And back then, all of that sounded so pie in the sky, partially because Salesforce needed to build so much of a backend to make that a realistic vision. Now, fast forward a few years, and now we see that with this combination of copilots and Windows, Microsoft is actually starting to develop, actually deliver on this vision of kind of a text-based OS for the enterprise. And it ends up being a real thing. It's just that we needed another couple of steps of technology to make this happen. And this is part of why Satya Nadella is obviously all in on AI. And it seems like this next step, as you mentioned from that Verge article, is the need to actually automate tasks going forward and figure out which of these processes and which of these data schemas and which of these multiple applications and services and APIs really need to be available and can be automated and trusted to work on their own on all of these extremely detail specific and detail oriented tasks, but in a way that is trustable, because we have all these tasks in our lives that we are trying to complete from a business perspective that require extremely governed and compliant processes that honestly are not very intellectual in nature and are scut work. They're busy work. So hopefully being able to push that complexity off to the AI without losing quality is going to be a
Yeah.
big
So I mean, let's talk
improvement.
a little bit. Where do I think where do I think this ends? And this is why I guess I'm not really bullish on the current approach taken, but it may be just the evolutionary process, right? But where does this end? Where this ends is that if I have a company with 1,000 knowledge workers, that what I actually have 1,000 co-pilots, but it's not that I have 1,000 co-pilots all doing different jobs. What I have is every individual knowledge worker has a co-pilot that is tuned to my specific job function, what it is that I'm doing, and it is able to help me with all of those things. And I think it ends up looking, we've been talking a lot about agentic AI. We've talked about mixture of experts, which is not this. It's an underlying component, but I think it
Mhm.
ends up feeling similar, right? In that what I end up with is a co-pilot is designed, like molded to my work, my job, so that it is able to help me with anything that I'm doing, and I don't have to think about it, right? And then behind the scenes, we've got these like underlying knowledge bases or models that we're leveraging then to do that. And right now, that's not how this is coming out, and it's I think it's flipped upside down at the moment. But I think we're going to get there. I think it's just a matter of what is that, how does that end up evolving?
Right. And right now, we've talked about that buy side with Microsoft and the Copilot side, but there's also a significant build side right now, as so many companies are trying to figure out what to do with AI. And I think a very pragmatic perspective of this is NVIDIA's recent announcement saying that 20,000 startups are now using NVIDIA GPUs on some way, are somehow on the NVIDIA platform. And it just shows that beyond the hype, there are actual numbers showing there are a lot of companies putting their chips in and figuring out how to invest in AI at this point. Everybody wants to figure out how to build their own very targeted models and agents, and nobody wants to be left behind.
It's a staggering number on the one hand. I mean, I guess not surprising in that clearly there's just a bucketfuls of money being flooded into the market, and so there's I was just talking to a CEO of a tech company yesterday, and
Mhm.
her statement was like, how can we not be, going full steam on AI? Everyone's asking about it. And what I told her is that, that's true, right? There's no question that it is it's going to be the first or second question you're going to get from a CIO today. What's your AI story? Because you have to have one. And yet, most of the issues that the average CIO or the average enterprise IT organization is facing today may be enabled or aided through AI, but they're not an AI problem looking for an AI solution, right?
Mhm.
And so I think the big challenge, that number was on the one hand unsurprising, on the other hand staggering, and slightly even concerning for me insofar as there's going to be so much hand waving. There's going to be so many people that are really not doing anything all that amazing or interesting, and but it's because it's like, oh look, we have AI too. And so whether that's an established company, I think that's going to be really prevalent there. But certainly within even the startup community, some of these startups, I'm seeing it's like, well, how is this a business, right? I think you're going to talk about this a little bit later. This is a broad issue, right? What's a feature? What's a product? What's a business?
Right.
And I think that's part of the challenge. And I think for a CIO that it makes it challenging to sort of separate the wheat from the chaff on all this. And I think it just means we're going to have to be really, really cautious and ask the hard questions and really understand how much of this is in fact differentiated, and are we in fact creating new models or doing things that are truly going to move the ball forward, because otherwise you are going to run the risk of waking up a year from now and having 100 co-pilots and 10,000 models from 10,000 companies, and none of it's going to make sense.
Yes, although I work on data and AI on a strategic basis, my technical background is actually going in networking, IT projects, infrastructure projects. And when I go back to that background, I honestly think of AI as a set of workloads that threaten core infrastructure performance. And I think it's important for CIOs to think about AI from that production perspective and making sure they are able to have the infrastructure capacity to simply avoid having core applications and projects, keep them from failing. That I see that as the real CIO goal in supporting AI. And I think that, for instance, Dell's recent announcement about their AI factory, being able to support edge workloads for AI and handling everything from network to the edge, of course, with the NVIDIA GPU in the middle, supporting AI, is an important piece of the puzzle. Of course, every major infrastructure player is going to come out with their bundle from an AI perspective, but I think it's important to be able to say, as a CIO, that you're going to be working with your vendor of choice and that they're going to be able to help fill in the gaps as we have to look at increasing our storage and networking and compute maybe by 20, 25, 30% over the next year to support even the smallest of AI projects.
Well, I think there's three sort of intersecting trends that the Dell and NVIDIA announcement sort of speak to, right? The first is that we are rapidly entering this space where we're now seriously asking, how do we start operationalizing this? How do we put this into production? How do we make it make sense? And that then leads to sort of the second big trend or issue that we're seeing, and that is that in doing that, we start to recognize that we have a risk factor if all these AI workloads are running exclusively in the cloud, which is what they have mostly been doing. So right now, the issue you're talking about hasn't been a problem because it basically had no impact on us. It was out running someplace in the ether and it didn't impact us. But as we start to operationalize, now we need to start asking where are we housing some of these workloads in-house? And if so, what does that do? And particularly if we're trying to deploy them at the edge, either because of challenges with connectivity or because of security or compliance constraints. And so that starts changing things. And that leads to the sort of the third evolution that we have talked about at bits in the past, but I've been recently digging much more deeply into, and that is this idea of small language models, right? This idea, right? So certainly the Databricks and the Snowflake announcements recently were focused on this idea of how do we start shrinking these platforms down. Clearly the work that Apple's doing for completely different reasons, but clearly the work that Apple has been focusing on, and Wired just did an article about this idea of pocket-sized models, because we have to be able to get these things into a manageable form if we want to not have to rely on the cloud to do it. And so what I found very interesting about the Dell NVIDIA announcement is that it's very focused on the sort of edge use case where we're, and not edge as in on the outlying, but literally at the edge of the architectural stack. And that I think is interesting because I do think when we talk about operationalizing it, that's where it's going to happen. And then the last little piece of this idea is that everyone, if I'm bleary-eyed because my 1-year-old was up last night, so I'm not sure if I already just talked about this or not, but this idea of bundling, that we have to have all these pieces sort of pulled together to operationalize it, right? And if you're a CIO, how do we make this process simpler? So I think there's a lot to like. I remain wary of what we just talked about, the hand waving. I think until we get under the covers to see how much of this is differentiated. But maybe it doesn't need to be differentiated. If all I'm doing is making it simpler for you to package and roll out, then that may be enough. If, like you said, Dell is already, if I'm a CIO, my vendor of choice anyway. So
yes, so we've talked about the Microsoft pushing for the proliferation of models, of course, supported with Databricks and Snowflake and other large vendor announcements. We've talked about how NVIDIA is already seeing 20,000 Gen AI startups working with them. And we're talking about these little models. So I brought a little prop with me, one of my old college textbooks. So when I was in college, I read a bunch of stuff like this. And the big takeaway here is, although yeah, big thick science textbook, but it's about 600 pages. Call it maybe a couple 100,000 words, maybe 1,000,000 tokens. So we're talking about a couple megabytes of text here, with maybe 50 to 100 megabytes of images. So put about 10 to 12 of these together. That's an entire major. That was my entire chemistry major, curriculum. Shove that into a model, and we're talking about not billions and billions of parameters. We're talking about millions of parameters, and that is a small model. So being able to put a college major's worth of information into a model, or a job's worth of information into a model that is custom built to support this a CoPilot or task-based capability is not actually all that difficult to imagine. We could create a lot of subject matter specific models that are going to be very well tuned to solve specific issues. And that might be the next step forward, if we're thinking about these pocket-sized models. And one of the big announcements that happened recently from a funding perspective is Scale.ai just raising $1 billion to help annotate and label data for models in solving this problem. One of the quotes I found interesting from their press release is from their CEO, who said that our vision is one of data abundance, where we have the means of production to continue scaling frontier LLMs to many more orders of magnitude. But I also think that being able to label data at scale also allows to be able to create smaller models very easily, without having to always think about how to get to the data or where the data needs to be further annotated manually.
So I'm bullish on Scale AI, but probably for the opposite reason. So all the press was about the frontier models and about the fact that they were doing this data labeling at scale. And the other part that people aren't talking about as much as they do data generation, right?
Yes.
So one of the issues we're having with the frontier models is they now become so big that they've literally consumed every piece of data we have on the internet, which is a staggering statement if you think about it. And they're like run out, right? And I think it speaks to this a limitation with how far we can take LLMs, at least using traditional training approaches, because really the approach they're using is they're using LLMs to generate data that they then use to train LLMs. And it becomes this recursive loop. And it's like, is that really going to get us further down the road or not? So it is another reason why I am becoming more convinced that the future is actually going to be maybe not exclusively these like itty bitty pocket sized models, but smaller language models, right? Focused, where we're now, instead of taking this like throw everything out it, let's see how we can actually train it with some intent. So I think that is this really interesting evolution of where this is going. But the other thing I think is really interesting is that they have a huge business model focused on helping enterprises take their data, label and classify it so that they can use it to train custom models. So we've talked in the past about the Databricks and the Snowflakes and these kind of approaches about helping enterprises come up with their models. Well, the gap there is in the data. And so I think Scale.ai has a real interesting future in front of it of helping enterprises bridge that gap. So I'm very bullish on it, but I do think it also points to some of the challenges we're going to have with the continuing evolution of LLMs, which is this ongoing, kind of conversation we keep having about it. And I know there were a couple of we're not going to have time to get into it, but there's a really interesting article about Anthropic's research. One of my challenges with the way people talk about LLMs is that all they're doing is predicting the next word, which is true, but it makes it sound like a fancy autocomplete. And this research that Anthropic is doing on Claude, their own LLM, is starting to identify that it's a little bit more than that, or maybe a lot more, where it's actually doing this sort of conceptual layer, and they're able to model out these neurons that fire around concepts and how they can tell the same word means different things in context. And it's like it fires off these different, I want to see a visualization of what that actually means, but it's like the impression they created was like a brain where you're watching the neurons fire. And it was really, really fascinating. And I think it speaks to both the fact that we don't really understand how these things work entirely, and therefore it's not sufficient to say they're just guessing the next word. And yet the data limitations and some of the there's plenty of criticism out there about they're not the future, particularly not the path to AGI. I think those are all valid and warranted. It just speaks to the fact that there's probably more about this we don't know than that we do, and trying to place, again, putting the CIO hat on, what bets you're going to make. You need to try to like get your head around where these limitations and opportunities lie.
Yeah, and I thought that I know you said we weren't going to talk about it, but I guess we are going to talk about it because I think it's interesting as well that Anthropic with its research is figuring out the forensics of where some of these language-based assumptions are coming from, and which parameters and which neurons really got hit within its model to figure out how to give you an answer. And I think that understanding of how AI is actually working is going to be an important next step from an AI governance perspective. It's not a coincidence that Anthropic recently hired a former OpenAI safety lead. I think Anthropic is really pushing their brand to be the more understandable AI or the more ethical AI. And regardless of the branding of ethics, I think that means that they are probably going to take more of a lead on showing how AI works. And I feel like when this generative AI topic really took off a couple of years ago now, it was partially luck. People, OpenAI threw a lot of stuff against the wall, and this ended up happening to be the perfect way to look at AI in a way that was very consumable. But the following 18 to 24 months have kind of shown that although there's been some work on productizing and some work on making the APIs work better, that they didn't really understand what they had created. They just knew that this viral thing had happened, and now we have to figure out why it works so well and what we find so appealing about it, other than that it gives us an answer.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, and I wasn't trying to take us down this hole because I know it's a big conversation. I will link to it, and maybe we'll talk about it more next week. But
Yeah.
it's definitely worth digging into because it exposes. I think it's our human nature to want to be reductive. We want to take something and boil it down into a way we can get our head around. And the reality is that these things are way too complex to boil down that simply. And I think it's an important conversation for the CIO because you need to understand the risk. You need to understand limitations. And the current conversation right now has been too limiting, I think, as far as what that means, both in terms of what it may be able to do, what its limitations are, what the risk factors are around hallucinations. I'm not functioning today, but all of those pieces. So I think it's all relevant. But I know we have other things we want to keep talking about.
Yes. So we have these interdependency issues that we're looking at on the AI side, but we still have the rest of IT to look at as well. Earlier this week, late last week, actually, I was at IBM Think over in Boston, my old stomping grounds where I lived for 20 years. Will always have a place in my heart for Boston. But one of the interesting things I saw there was they announced a product called IBM Concert that helps companies to look at interdependencies and compliance gaps across the software ecosystem. They can see which pictures or photos or videos or documents are linked to multiple applications, and then see how that might be a compliance risk if, for instance, access to that document is opened up to the world at large or to employees that should not have access to certain applications or certain capabilities. So being able to see these interlinked relationships across software and across software assets and across software access across your entire company is an interesting capability, I think, at a time when we're looking at the 1,000+ apps that exist in the standard enterprise, as well as honestly the thousands of apps and agents that are about to come into play with this new set of AI factory capabilities and the new development capabilities that are coming into play in the AI world.
So, two immediate comments. The first is it going back to the Microsoft and the 130 copilots. This you're nailing part of the challenge that I guess I have with that, and I didn't articulate it well.
Mhm.
And that we already have so much complexity in the enterprise. The last thing we want to do is introduce more, and that's what I fear that's doing. The second thing is IBM needs to hire you, because I read that press release twice, and you just did a better job of explaining what the heck it really is doing than that press release did. I mean, it was. I read that press release scratching my head going, isn't this just an APM tool? And now you just explained it in a way that was so much more clear as to what this is really all about. And that solves, that it is in fact solving a very significant issue in this time of complexity that I think organizations are facing. And I'm, rather than focusing specifically on what it does, I'm not a big fan of, or not a fan of, I don't dig deep into the compliance and security and risk areas that much. But what I do think it speaks to, and what I appreciate about it, is that I think the evolution of all of this is, we spend a lot of time talking about these frontier models, and they're necessary because they're the foundation of everything. But where the rubber meets the road is when we can start applying this technology in a very meaningful way. What I love about this particular story is that while there's a generative element to it,
Mhm.
it is also using these models in a much more pragmatic and a non-conversational way that actually produces real value in an operational context when we're trying to grapple with all this complexity. And that, I think, is a really critical part of the story that often gets missed. One of the companies that I'm working with is a company called Symphony AI, and they're super, super big on this connection between generative and predictive AI and bringing them together. And I think if you as an organization, as a tech company, aren't going down that road where you're not just like, how can I create a conversational interface to slap on top of something, you're going to miss the boat, because we need both these pieces together to solve the real problems. And this announcement by IBM is a classic example of that. It's right. You don't solve this by just exposing the data. There's too much data. Applying this layer of AI to help sort through it becomes super, super critical. So now that I understand what they do, thank you very much. I think it's great. It's cool stuff.
Yeah, but I have to admit that although I find it to be a cool capability, and I think about SaaS management and governance issues, I also think to some extent that this is a little challenging from a productization component perspective, because when I try to figure out who in the CIO organization is responsible for understanding broad software interdependencies at scale, that doesn't sound like a specific person's job to me. And it doesn't sound like the primary tasks for any of the most strategic jobs in the CIO world. Obviously, it matters a lot from a governance perspective. It does matter to any IT architect as a major component, but it's not anybody's primary job. This feels like something that can add to multiple people's jobs. Yes, the CISO should definitely look at this. Anybody involved in governance, risk management, and compliance should be looking at this. Anybody who is thinking about software portfolios should be looking at this. As anybody who's involved in content management in a broad way should be looking at this. Yes, they're like all these roles should be looking at this kind of data, but it's none of those people's primary job to look at this IBM Concert graph of interdependencies and capabilities and say, okay, this is going to be 80% of my job. So I think that's a challenge on the, yeah. So I think that's a challenge on the AI side, that we're going to see all these cool capabilities. People are going to sell it as products. And then I think the immediate next answer is going to be, so who's going to buy this and how do we actually use this correctly?
So I think this is bigger than an AI issue. I think there's a lot of really interesting software companies that have come to market, and part of their big problem is that they are closing a gap But the reason the reason that gap exists in the first place is nobody is responsible for closing that gap.
Mhm.
And so they don't have a natural economic buyer. They have to go all the way to a CIO or maybe all the way to a CEO, right? To find somebody who actually owns the whole thing enough to care about solving that problem. Now, what's
Yes.
interesting about that, so the economic buying problem aside for a moment, is that going all the way back to what we've been talking about, starting with Microsoft and the 130 copilots, and this idea of mixing agentic AI elements, predictive AI, conversational AI all together, is that I think there's an opportunity here for a class of technology that sort of sits in this middle space, whose job it is to close the gaps. And instead of having to create new people, because we talked about the fact that I've got these functional domains for a reason, but those are also the problem, right? And so to sit there and peanut butter across that and act as an intelligence layer to connect the dots. So you're right. No one person is this is their whole job. But if I can stick a layer of technology of an AI that it is their job, and then it feeds those alerts or say, hey, you better be looking at this to the people whose job is somehow related to it at the right time, suddenly that can be super powerful. So you still have to solve who do you sell that to? Who cares enough to buy it? But once you get past that, it could be a really interesting layer where it never makes sense to build a functional team to do that. But if I can apply an agent, an AI agent to do that job, that could be really interesting. So I think what I think is going to be the next stage, and I don't know if this is in a year or 10 years, but we're going to start seeing I think a transformation how organizations are structured and function as we start seeing AI start changing the way we can operate. So it's going to be a lot more to come, I think, with around this
Yeah.
kind of stuff.
One thing I've seen recently, both at Boomi World and Informatica World, obviously two big integration players in the IT world, is that they've been talking about initial steps on how to manage agents and figure out how to do agent integration, figure out these agent catalogs. And the story is very similar to application integration and API management strategies, but focused on the agent strategy. And I'm not sure that that capability is going to work exactly as modeled because AI requires a little bit of additional thinking rather than specific API or application definitions. There might have to be some sort of intermediate AI to figure out some of that parsing, maybe this mixture of experts approach to help figure out what goes where as some sort of a train conductor for AI agents, for lack of a better analogy, is going to have to exist. But I agree with you, Charlie, that this intermediate peanut butter layer of figuring out what is going to actually go where and who's going to work with what is going to be increasingly important as we start having all these copilots and all these agents and all of these other AI related capabilities that are all going to be super useful, but aren't necessarily transparent and obvious at a moment's notice that you're trying to get to them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's I think the big takeaway that I'd be looking at is step one, where we're at, is figure out how you can use AI to solve specific problems. Step two is start thinking about how you can start using AI to reimagine what those problems are or how you're actually functioning and working. And I think that may be the bigger. There's some other articles that we'll talk about next week. I think that will be the bigger challenge because we are just at the beginning stages of, I think, the cultural transformation within organizations that's going to happen as we start really figuring out how to leverage and operationalize and applying it to solving these real problems. And I think the interesting part is it's moving super super fast, but we're still at the very very early stages. But I know we're already running long, so I think there was I don't know how much more else we wanted to cover.
Well, I think there's one more thing, one more trend that was interesting that showed up in the Wall Street Journal. And I think it's a good way to kind of sew this up, that as we're thinking about how to move forward over the next year or two, first, we're going to have to figure out how to organize that work, how to prioritize what work is going to happen, and honestly, how to build this into projects and put this into our IT portfolio, which leads to a challenge that has been endemic in the IT world for a while. How to support work management and project management. I know that on the SaaS management side, the category that sees the greatest explosion of solutions use is always project management. It is not uncommon to go into an enterprise and on doing an initial audit, finding that there's 15, 20, 25 project management solutions, often that look very similar, but once you start digging in, you see that part of the challenge here is that work management has changed and evolved a lot over the past, call it decade, 15 years, to require multiple solutions here.
Well, so it is an absolutely, we could probably spend the entire show talking about this evolution in my mind, because it is so fascinating and near and dear to my heart on a couple levels. But like, you're using two terms almost interchangeably, and I think they represent this evolution, right? We have historically, for the last probably more than 30, 50 years, talked about project management, right? Microsoft Project was like the big thing, that, you know, Gantt charts and waterfall approaches and it was this big idea of big projects that we were managing all these resources together. What I think is interesting, we're now talking about work management, and we sometimes use them synonymously, but work management is really sort of the opposite perspective. It's the idea that I personally, as an individual knowledge worker, am trying to manage my work in the context of these bigger projects. But the reality is, I'm not living and working on one project. I'm working on tens, maybe hundreds of projects, or I'm part of them, or maybe not even projects, maybe just workflows that I'm taking actions. And so we're seeing this really interesting evolution. So there's an entire category of companies that are doing work management now, people like Asana, Rike, Monday.com. Zoho just introduced a new thing called Tables, which I think that's what it's called, which is sort of a version of work management. Airtables is out there. There's all these, it's this growing area that of people leveraging tools to effectively create databases as a way to manage the flow of work for myself, for an individual. And then there's an entire, other category of like personal knowledge management that like I use. It's a product called Capacities. And I literally, every single thing I do is in there. That's my work management tool that I'm using for all of these things. And it all flows together. And I think it is, what is really fascinating is two sides of this. One is, you're right, these are so personal. This article about the Wall Street Journal was talking about how people get so personally invested in whatever they're using to manage their work that trying to rip it out of their hands is, a very challenging thing. But we're going to have to get better at managing work. It's a sort of an irony with all this talk about AI, where we're automating everything. The reality on the ground for the individual worker is things have become more complex. Things have been harder to figure out what you should be working on and how to prioritize and how to manage. So I think that we're going to see this space begin to explode and collide with the ServiceNows of the world and the Symphonies of the world that are really in the business of workflow orchestration and automation. And as those workflows are intersecting with the individual work management function, we're starting to see crossover, right? And so I think it's going to be really, really interesting to see how all these sort of worlds start to intersect and what sort of comes out at the other end, because I struggle with it every single day. And I think almost everyone who tries to manage their work is struggling with all these different tools you're using and how and when to use which one.
Yes. From an integration perspective, just thinking about recent earnings reports, ServiceNow keeps growing 20% a year and has been making big promises on their revenue. Obviously, the top-down definition of services and process and workflow management isn't going anywhere, and there's a huge demand for it. In Salesforce's most recent announcement, MuleSoft revenue was up something like 25% year over year. So obviously still a huge demand for application integration. And this is probably an area that is going to keep growing. Great news for the integration people. Your job isn't going anywhere. Your work is just going to get harder and harder with the proliferation of apps happening right now. But this also means that companies have to figure out what is our integration strategy right now, as applications probably double again over the next 5 years. And as these work management capabilities are going nowhere, and we're going to see increasing automation. This means more to manage from a digital perspective, not less, and not just more, but significantly more, leading to an order of magnitude more over the next decade or so. That's the reality that we have to look at. We are not just looking at incremental growth as we did the last 3 to 5 years, where we had some cool automation going, but it was definitely manually manageable with the processes that we had in place. We're going to have to see this transformation of automation strategy over the next few years.
I agree. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that if I'm a CIO today, I need to be thinking about it across all of those dimensions. How am I doing that at a macro level across the enterprise? But also, how am I addressing that? How is that going to manifest on an individual level for my knowledge workers, for my employees? And how can I help them manage this complexity? Not only the complexity of all the different technologies they have to use to do their job, but the complexity of that workflow, of all these different workflows intersecting, and how they deal with and address that. And how can I leverage automation to help them solve some of that, but do it in a way that it's not obtrusive, that I'm not saying you're not allowed to use that software, even if that works for you and makes you more efficient, you have to use this software, right? How do I allow all this to work and interact? And ironically enough, I think AI is going to help with a lot of that. It's going to, create this layer that helps create, an integration layer, not in the data integration way, but in a process integration, in the way I think integration that allows me to communicate and interact with others, even if we're using different tools, almost like the Star Trek Universal Translator for enterprise software, right? And I think that's what we're going to find out, is that I can go and query my Copilot to ask whatever I need to get information or to interact or perform an action that I need done, even if it's happening with somebody else who's using a different system, that becomes what, how I can interact. And I think that that's where this is going to land, because we're never, I was just talking to the same CEO. It's like, we're not going to go back to these days where, the cycles where we would rationalize everything back down into this nice simple box. It's just not going to happen. So it's now instead, how do you figure out a way to make all of it work together cohesively?
Yes, and that is IT for 2024, 2025. That is what we're facing for the rest of the decade. Yes.
Yeah, exactly.
And
Exactly.
on that note, I think that's a great place to summarize the challenges that we are facing in an AI-infused IT world. As always, thanks for joining us. Please like, please subscribe, please comment, and please email us if you've got anything else you've got questions about. As always, I'm Hyoun Park here with Charlie Araujo. Thanks for joining us.